November the 2nd, 1932, Campion, Western Australia. Major GPW Meredith of the Australian Royal Artillery stood in a wheat field surveying the enemy. Before him, stretching across the landscape, were approximately 20,000 emus, large, flightless birds, standing up to 6 feet tall, with powerful legs and an attitude problem. Meredith had 2 Lewis machine guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and orders from the Australian government to eliminate the emu threat. He was a veteran of World War I. He'd fought in France, faced enemy machine guns, survived artillery barrages. This should be simple. It was not simple. By the end of November, after weeks of operations, Meredith's forces had fired thousands of rounds and killed only a fraction of the emus. The birds had proven to be surprisingly tactical opponents. They scattered when attacked, ran at speeds up to 30 miles per hour, and seemed to absorb bullets without dying. The military operation was called off in humiliation. The media had a field day. Newspapers ran headlines mocking the army's defeat. Australia had declared war on birds, and Australia had lost. This is the story of the Great Emu War of 1932. The military operation so ridiculous, so embarrassing, and so thoroughly unsuccessful that it became a legend of governmental incompetence and wildlife resilience. This is War Blunders. To understand why the Australian military was deployed against emus, we need to understand Australia in 1932. The Great Depression had devastated the Australian economy. Wheat prices had collapsed. Farmers were struggling. The government was desperate to help them. After World War I, the Australian government had encouraged returned soldiers to settle in Western Australia and take up farming. They were given land grants, essentially free farmland, to grow wheat. Thousands of veterans took the offer. They moved to remote areas of Western Australia, cleared the land, and planted wheat. The problem was that Western Australia was also home to massive emu populations. Emus are large, flightless birds native to Australia. They can stand up to 6.5 feet tall and weigh over 100 pounds. They're fast. They can run at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. And they migrate in huge numbers following seasonal food and water sources. Normally, the emus would migrate inland during certain seasons, but the wheat farms created by the soldier settlers provided a new, abundant food source right when the emus needed it. In 1932, after breeding season, approximately 20,000 emus began migrating from the interior toward the coast, and they went straight through the wheat farming regions. The emus were devastating. They trampled crops, destroyed fences, and ate whatever wheat they could reach. A flock of emus could destroy a wheat field in hours. The farmers were already struggling with low wheat prices. Now they were losing entire crops to birds. They couldn't afford to keep repairing fences. They couldn't afford to replant destroyed fields. They were desperate, and many of these farmers were war veterans who'd fought for Australia and felt the government owed them support. They demanded action. They lobbied politicians. They wrote letters. They organized petitions. The farmers wanted the government to do something about the emus, offer bounties for dead birds, provide ammunition for hunting, anything. The government of Western Australia was sympathetic, but had no money. The Depression meant budgets were slashed. There was no funding for emu control programs. Then someone, and it's not entirely clear who suggested this first, had an idea. The farmers were mostly returned soldiers. Many had served in the military. Why not treat the emu problem as a military operation? Deploy the army, give them machine guns, eliminate the emu threat with military efficiency. It sounds insane now, but in 1932, it seemed like a creative solution. The military had equipment sitting idle. The soldiers needed training exercises anyway. Why not solve a real problem while training? The Minister for Defense, Sir George Pearce, approved the operation. He framed it as a training exercise for soldiers and a public relations opportunity to show the government was helping farmers. In October 1932, the military operation was authorized. Major GPW Meredith, a decorated World War I officer, was placed in command. He was given 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. His orders were simple: go to Western Australia and kill as many emus as possible. Major Meredith took this seriously. He'd fought in the Great War. He understood military operations. He developed a strategy. The Lewis gun was a light machine gun used extensively in World War I. It was reliable, mobile, and could fire up to 500 rounds per minute. 2 Lewis guns with 10,000 rounds should be more than sufficient to handle some birds. The plan was straightforward: locate the emu flocks, set up the machine guns, and fire into the concentrated masses of birds. Simple, efficient, effective. On November the 2nd, 1932, Major Meredith and his 2 soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran, arrived in Campion, a small town in Western Australia's wheat belt. They met with local farmers who showed them where the emu flocks were concentrated. The reports were accurate. There were indeed thousands of emus destroying crops. Meredith observed the enemy: large birds, flightless, moving in groups. They seemed unafraid of humans because they'd had little prior contact with people in these remote areas. This would be a massacre, Meredith thought. They'd never faced machine guns before. He was right about one thing: it would be a massacre, just not the massacre he expected. November the 2nd, 1932. First engagement. Meredith and his men located a group of approximately 50 emus gathered near a dam. Perfect target. The emus were grouped together, not particularly alert, within range. The soldiers set up one of the Lewis guns. They aimed carefully. Meredith gave the order to fire. The machine gun roared. Bullets tore through the air toward the emus. And the emus scattered. Within seconds, the flock had broken into multiple small groups, running in different directions at high speed. The machine gun couldn't track them all. It fired at where the emus had been, not where they were going. By the time the firing stopped, only a handful of emus were dead. The rest had escaped. Meredith was surprised, but not discouraged. The birds had been lucky. Next time they'd set up an ambush. Over the next few days, Meredith and his men tried different tactics. They attempted to herd emus into kill zones where the machine guns could concentrate fire. The emus refused to be herded and scattered the moment they sensed danger. They tried setting up ambushes near watering holes where emus congregated. The emus seemed to detect the soldiers before they got into position and would disperse before the shooting started. They tried mounting one of the Lewis guns on a truck and driving alongside running emus to shoot them. The truck couldn't keep up on the rough terrain, and the bouncing made accurate fire impossible. After several days, the kill count was embarrassingly low. Hundreds of rounds fired. Maybe a dozen emus killed. The ammunition was being expended far faster than birds were dying. Local farmers began to complain. They'd expected the military to solve the problem quickly. Instead, they were watching soldiers waste ammunition, shooting at birds that kept escaping. The media got wind of the story, and they loved it. Newspaper reporters from Perth and other cities traveled to the wheat belt to cover the war. They interviewed farmers, watched the soldiers' futile attempts to shoot the emus, and wrote increasingly mocking articles. The Sydney Morning Herald ran a piece suggesting that the emus should be given medals for their successful tactics against the military. One ornithologist who observed the operations noted, "The emus have developed tactics almost military in nature. They seem to have developed a system where they post sentries while the main flock feeds, and when the sentries detect danger, they give a signal and the entire flock scatters in different directions." Another observer wrote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The observation about bullet capacity was accurate. Emus are remarkably tough birds. Their thick feathers and tough skin can absorb multiple bullets without immediately killing them. Unless hit in vital areas, head, neck, or heart, emus could keep running even after taking several rounds, and they were fast. At 30 miles per hour, they could cover significant ground in seconds. A machine gun crew had only a brief window to track and hit a running emu before it was out of range. Major Meredith tried to maintain professionalism. He submitted reports to the military command, but even his official reports revealed the frustration. On November 4th, he reported an engagement where his troops fired on a group of emus. Initial reports suggested 12 kills, but when soldiers went to collect the bodies, they found only 3 dead emus. The others had been wounded but escaped. On November 5th, soldiers encountered a group of about 1,000 emus. They waited until the birds were in close formation, then opened fire with both machine guns. The emus scattered immediately, running in hundreds of different directions. Estimated kills: 10. The soldiers were experienced. They weren't missing out of incompetence. They were facing opponents that moved unpredictably, absorbed damage, and learned from each encounter. After the first week, the emus had learned to stay farther from humans. They'd post watchers. They'd scatter at the first sound of a truck engine or the sight of humans approaching. They'd adapted. The birds were learning faster than the military could adjust tactics. By November 8th, after a week of operations, the military had expended approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition and killed perhaps 50 emus. That's 50 rounds per confirmed kill. For context, in World War I, it took an average of 7,000 rounds of small arms ammunition to kill one enemy soldier. But soldiers could take cover, had weapons, and used tactics. These were birds, and it was taking 50 rounds per bird. The military command in Perth was not happy. This was supposed to be a public relations success, showing the government helping farmers. Instead, it was becoming a public relations disaster, showing the military's incompetence. The media was having too much fun with it. Political opponents were mocking the government. Questions were being asked in Parliament. On November 8th, the operation was suspended. Major Meredith and his men were ordered to cease operations and return to base. The official explanation was that the military wanted to reassess tactics. The unofficial reality was that this was an embarrassment that needed to end. The farmers were furious. The emus were still there, still destroying crops. The military had failed to solve the problem. The media declared victory for the emus. Headlines celebrated the birds' successful defense against Australian military forces. One newspaper wrote, "The emus have won the Great Emu War of 1932. But this wasn't quite the end. After intense lobbying from farmers and pressure on the government, a second operation was authorized later in November. Major Meredith returned to Western Australia with the same equipment and instructions to do better this time. The second operation went slightly better, but only slightly. The soldiers adjusted their tactics. They set up more carefully planned ambushes. They waited longer before opening fire. Over the following weeks, they managed to kill more emus. Estimates vary, but Meredith later claimed approximately 986 emus killed in the second operation, though independent observers suggested the number was lower, perhaps 300, 400. But even if we accept Meredith's higher numbers, the mathematics were terrible. Thousands more rounds of ammunition expended, weeks of military time, transport costs, personnel costs. And there were still thousands of emus in the region. In early December, the second operation was also called off. The military had better things to do. The cost in ammunition and resources far exceeded any benefit. The Great Emu War was over. Australia had deployed military forces against birds. The birds had won. The immediate aftermath was a mix of embarrassment and farce. The Australian government tried to downplay the operation. Official reports emphasized that it had been a limited training exercise, not a full military campaign. But the media wasn't buying it. The story spread internationally. British newspapers ran mocking articles about Australia's defeat to birds. American papers found it hilarious. The Great Emu War became a global joke at Australia's expense. In Parliament, members of the opposition had a field day. They questioned why military resources were wasted on birds when real defense needs existed. They mocked the government's judgment in approving the operation. One member of Parliament sarcastically suggested that the emus should be given medals for their victory over Australian forces. Another proposed that since the emus had defeated the military, perhaps Australia should negotiate a peace treaty with them. The Minister for Defence, Sir George Pearce, was forced to defend the operation. He argued that it had been a reasonable attempt to help struggling farmers. He pointed out that some emus had been killed and some crop damage prevented. But even he couldn't defend it with much enthusiasm. It was clearly a failure. The farmers, meanwhile, were back where they started. The emus were still there. Crops were still being destroyed. And now they couldn't even ask for military help because that option had been tried and failed spectacularly. The government eventually provided some ammunition to farmers for hunting and later implemented a bounty system, paying farmers for each emu beak they turned in. This proved somewhat more effective than military operations, though the emu problem persisted for years. Major Meredith wrote an official report after the second operation. It's a fascinating document because he tried to maintain military professionalism while essentially admitting defeat to birds. He wrote, "The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were not realized. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics." Read that again. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics. He's attributing military strategy to birds, he continued. The birds split up into small units, which made concentrated fire difficult. They employed scouts who detected the approach of humans and warned the main flock. Meredith was describing the emus as if they were an organized military force with command structure, tactics, and intelligence operations. And in a sense, he was right. The emus had adapted their behavior in response to the threat. They weren't consciously employing military tactics, but evolution had given them survival instincts that happened to be tactically sound. Stay spread out to avoid concentrated fire. Post sentries to detect threats early. Run fast and unpredictably when attacked. Absorb damage and keep moving. These are all effective tactics, whether you're a soldier or a bird. The story of the Great Emu War entered Australian folklore. It became a beloved piece of national self-mockery. Australians are known for their self-deprecating humor, and the Emu War fit perfectly. It spawned jokes, memes, once the internet existed, references in comedy shows, and countless retellings. Every Australian schoolchild learns about the Emu War at some point. It's taught as a cautionary tale about government overreach and the law of unintended consequences. It's used in biology classes to discuss animal adaptation and resilience. It's cited in military history as an example of how unconventional opponents require unconventional tactics. Interestingly, the story has become more famous over time, not less. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was an embarrassing recent memory. By the 1960s-70s, it had become a funny historical anecdote. By the 2000s, with the rise of internet culture, it became a viral sensation. Thousands of memes, YouTube videos, and social media posts celebrate the Emu War. There are video games based on it, historical videos documenting it, comedy sketches reenacting it. The emus have become unlikely heroes, symbols of nature's ability to resist human attempts at control. From a biological standpoint, the Emu War revealed how challenging it is to control wildlife populations through direct, lethal means. Modern wildlife management has learned these lessons. Emus are still common in Australia, including in agricultural areas, But modern management focuses on fencing, habitat modification, and non-lethal deterrence rather than mass killing operations. The Emu War proved that throwing military force at a wildlife problem doesn't work. You can't defeat an animal population the way you defeat an army. They don't surrender. They don't have supply lines to cut. They just keep being birds. So what can we learn from Australia's war against emus? First, military solutions aren't appropriate for every problem. The Australian government saw a problem, crop damage from birds, and decided the answer was machine guns. This was a fundamental category error. You can't solve ecological problems with military tactics. Second, nature is more resilient than we expect. The emus didn't outsmart the soldiers in a cognitive sense, but their natural behaviors, scattering, running, survival instincts, happened to be perfect counter-tactics against machine guns. Evolution had already prepared them. Third, public relations matter. The Emu War might have killed some birds, but it killed the government's credibility far more effectively. The mockery and embarrassment lasted far longer than any benefit from the dead emus. Fourth, know your enemy. The soldiers were trained to fight human opponents, enemies that formed lines, held positions, and could be pinned down. Emus did none of these things. Applying human warfare tactics to wildlife didn't work. Fifth, sometimes the solution is worse than the problem. The cost in ammunition, military personnel, transportation, and damaged reputation far exceeded any benefit from the dead emus. A simple bounty system, implemented from the start, would have been cheaper and more effective. The Great Emu War stands alone among war blunders because there was no enemy army, no opposing general, no tactical master plan that went wrong, just 20,000 birds doing what birds do, eating, running, surviving, and a military force unable to effectively counter those basic biological imperatives. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's impossible to tell the story without smiling, but it's also real. It actually happened. Australia actually deployed military forces with machine guns against emus, and the emus actually won. Today, if you visit Western Australia, you'll see plenty of emus. They're still there, still tall, still fast, still eating crops occasionally, undefeated. The birds that beat the Australian military in 1932 have descendants roaming the outback today, completely unaware that their great-great-grandparents are legends of military history. That was the Great Emu War of 1932, a military operation against wildlife, machine guns against flightless birds, thousands of rounds expended for minimal results, a defeat that became a legend, the war Australia declared on birds and lost.